There is a question that does not get asked often enough about the concept of convivencia, and it is a simple one. Why Spain? When scholars, journalists, and politicians reach for a historical example of Muslims, Christians, and Jews living together in the same society, they almost always reach for medieval Iberia, al-Andalus, the Alhambra, Maimonides walking the streets of Cordoba. It has become the standard reference point for interfaith coexistence in the medieval world, the place people invoke when they want to argue that Islam and the West have a history of productive encounter rather than perpetual conflict. But if you step back and think about it, the choice is strange because Egypt fits the description just as well, and in some respects, better. Egypt was majority Christian until roughly the 13th or 14th century. Its Coptic Christian community has been present continuously from late antiquity through the Islamic conquest, through the Fatimid Caliphate, through the Mamluk Sultanate, and into the present day. Its Jewish community, one of the oldest in the world, did not leave until the middle of the 20th century, expelled not by a medieval monarch, but by the pressures of modern nationalism and the Arab-Israeli conflict. If longevity and continuity are the measures of successful coexistence, Egypt has a stronger claim than Spain. So why does nobody write best-selling books about Egyptian convivencia? The answer, I want to argue, has almost nothing to do with the Middle Ages. It has everything to do with the 20th century, and with who was doing the talking, why they were doing it, and who they thought was listening. The word convivencia itself comes from Americo Castro, a Spanish philologist, who published a book called España en su historia in 1948. Castro was a Republican exile driven out of Spain by Franco's victory in the Civil War, writing from Princeton with the pain of defeat still fresh. He needed a vision of Spain that could stand against the Catholic nationalist ideology that had crushed the Republic, an image of his country's past that was pluralist, creative, and fundamentally incompatible with Francoist mythology. Al-Andalus gave him that. The medieval period in which Muslims, Christians, and Jews had shared the Iberian Peninsula became, in Castro's hands, the true source of Spain's cultural genius. The great figures of medieval Spanish civilization, he argued, were products of this encounter, not of any single religious tradition. Convivencia was not merely a historical description, it was a political argument dressed in the language of scholarship. That origin matters because it tells us what convivencia was always for. It was a tool in a debate against Spain's identity, a debate being conducted by Spaniards and Hispanophiles, for an audience that cared about Spain. Egypt was never a part of that conversation because nobody in that conversation needed Egypt to be. Later in the 20th century, particularly after the publications of scholars like Maria Rosa Menosal, convivencia migrated from academic debate into broader cultural argument, especially in the United States. Menosal's The Ornament of the World, published in 2002, appeared after the September 11th attacks, and its timing was not incidental to its reception. It offered American readers, reeling from a moment that seemed to pit Islam against the West as permanent civilizational enemies, a story in which the two had once produced something beautiful together. Al-Andalus was perfectly positioned for that argument. It was in Europe. It was legible through monuments and figures already familiar from a Western humanistic education. Averroes, whose commentaries on Aristotle had shaped scholastic philosophy, was from Cordoba. Maimonides, whose Guide for the Perplexed sat on the shelves of every university library, was from Cordoba. The Alhambra was already a fixture of European romantic imagination, visited by Washington Irving nearly 2 centuries earlier. The story could be told in a language Western audiences already partly knew. Egypt did not have that portfolio in the Western imagination. The Coptic Church, despite its extraordinary antiquity, was not a part of the standard survey of Western civilization. The Fatimid Caliphate, despite its remarkable record of cross-confessional court culture, was not a name that rang immediate bells in American undergraduate classrooms. The history was real, but it had not been packaged and marketed for a Western audience that needed a usable medieval past. There's also a structural reason why Spain became the template and Egypt did not, and it has to do with the shape of the story. The Convivencia myth depends on catastrophe. It needs an ending. The expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, the forced baptism of Muslims, the systematic dismantling of a society that had, whatever its tensions and inequalities, sustained 3 religious communities for centuries. This is what transforms the preceding period into a golden age. Loss produces nostalgia. Nostalgia produces myth. Egypt's story does not have that shape. The shift from Christian majority to Muslim majority was gradual, spread over centuries, without a single edict that could anchor a before and after. The departure of the Jewish community in the 20th century was real and often traumatic, but it unfolded over decades and was entangled with events. The 1948 war with Israel, the Suez Crisis, Nasserist nationalism that resisted reduction to a simple narrative of expulsion and exile. The story does not end with a date that everyone can remember, and without that date, it is harder to construct the myth. None of this means that convivencia, as applied to Spain, is simply false. The history of these groups living in contact is real, even if the romantic version of it smooths over coercions, conversions, and violence that the myth prefers to forget. And the history of Christian-Muslim-Jewish interaction in medieval Egypt is equally real, equally complex, and in some periods equally remarkable. The Fatimid caliphs employed Christian and Jewish administrators at the highest levels of their court. Coptic scribes worked in Arabic. Jewish merchants operated under legal frameworks that, while never treating them as equals, gave them protections and economic freedoms that varied considerably across time and dynasty. The point is not that Egypt deserves its own golden age myth to set against Spain's. Myths of that kind always distort more than they illuminate. The point is that the choice of Spain as the defining case of medieval interfaith coexistence was never primarily a historical judgment. It was a cultural and political one made by specific people in specific circumstances for specific audiences, and it has been reproduced ever since because it continues to serve those same functions. If we want to understand how Muslims, Christians, and Jews actually negotiated shared space in the medieval world, we need a wider frame. Egypt belongs in that frame. So does the Fatimid Caliphate. So do the Jewish communities of the Ottoman Empire, the Christian merchants of Mamluk Cairo, and a dozen other cases that the convivencia myth has pushed to the margins by insisting that what happened in Cordoba and Toledo is the story worth telling.